I'm glad I got the profanity out of the way before I pressed record. My name is Brian Goldstein. I'm a developer at Spry Digital. I'm going to be talking about type systems today. That's type and type systems. I deliberately designed this to be as broad and as detailed as I could possibly fit into 45 minutes. So whether you're a developer, a designer, a PM, business development person, you'll have something to take away from this, I hope. It went pretty well when I ran it through at a lunch and learn inside Spry, so that's how it ended up here. How many of y'all were in Simon's? Could I get a clap? So like three or four of you. How many of you guys watched Kevin's presentation? Clap. About 5. So both of them talked about a couple things. 2 themes that kind of provide a through line through our lectures. Simon's was all about systems, so obviously that plays part of this. And then Kevin's was about practical application and getting people to buy into doing things a better way. And both of those things are a big part of why I ended up making this presentation. And so if you have any questions about why I included something or why I chose to do something that way, that's kind of the through line that I was working toward. The other thing I want to say as a disclaimer is that this isn't an authoritative, like, do it this way or you're wrong kind of speech. This is a reflection, like all systems, of the creator's preferences and biases, more so than any kind of objective reality. And that's important to consider when you're evaluating other people's systems too. You don't understand the constraints that they're under or their preferences or why they choose to do things. So let's get started. Let's start really, really broad. I know a lot of people in this room, because it's a Drupal camp, are going to be developers. And so your answer to this would be, I build websites using Drupal, right? Basically, show of hands. Most of the room is raising their hand on that. I would make a slightly more nuanced argument. As you'll see, I do that a lot, because I'm a pain in the ass. And that is that our basic job function, though, is to be designers. And I'm using a very specific definition of designer here, and that is one who solves problems by deciding what to make and how to make them. Does everybody generally agree with that definition? Everybody's nodding their head. And if I repeat things that you're like nodding your head to, it's for the benefit of people who get to watch this later. So if we accept that definition of a designer as someone who decides what to make and how to make it, and that's how we solve problems, it begs the obvious question of how do we solve problems? How do we go from this Rubik's Cube to this one? And the answer is that other than fuddling around for a couple hours like a moron, there's a simple mathematical algorithm that just about anybody can learn if they're willing to, and you can figure out how to solve any Rubik's Cube. And all an algorithm is a mathematical term for a system. And again, I'm using a very specific definition of what a system is. And if you left Simon's presentation about systems and you were wondering, well, what does that actually mean? Here's something you can walk away with. Systems are the how. Systems are closed sets of relationships that produce a predictable result. And for the designers in the room, by which I mean the people whose primary job is to create visual assets or come up with layouts, this is not a new concept in design history. Probably the most famous 20th century designer, Massimo Vignelli, you can still see his work in the New York City subway system as the signage, talks a lot about using standardized paper sizes, using reusable layouts for books, talks about making uniform grids. Probably his most lasting contribution is that the National Park Service, for all of their printed materials, still uses the same grid system that he came up with 50 years ago. He talks about choosing from a limited pool of colors and fonts and infinite creativity using these limited resources. And that system helped make elegant, lasting design. So systems are the how. And again, it's not a new concept, so there's not a lot of selling here. But what's the value proposition for it? Well, for the business folks in the room, if you've got a business development or sales role, or you're a project management person and your job is to deliver projects on time and on budget, systems kind of sell themselves. You can think of it as an acrostic for saving yourself time and money. Yes, I know an ampersand is not an E, but it kind of looks like one with that font. For everybody else, I'm going to make, again, a more nuanced argument here, and that is that systems actually unlock creativity. Think Think back to 3rd grade and the first time you had to write a book report. Do you remember learning the 5-paragraph essay format? That's a system. Once you learned that, you didn't have to worry about how to write an essay anymore. You could just focus on making a better argument and finding better evidence to support it. Systems unlock creativity by helping us focus on how to better solve our problems, not on just how to complete the problem. Does everybody follow and track with that? So if you're a designer in the room and you're like, oh, my boundless infinite creativity cannot be restrained by a system, 1, please leave. I have no respect for you. 2, recognize that systems are there to help you. And I'm going to talk to you about how to design them to make your life and job better. So I've sold you on systems. I've shown you that they're a part of design history. I've shown you that they have a real benefit to designers and developers and PMs and business people. But why start with type? Well, there's this old saw that web design is 95% typography. I think today, because videos and infographics and pictures are so much more widely shareable than they used to be, this is an exaggeration by degree, but not of kind. At the end of the day, we get browsers that render pages in HTML, and HTML was designed to link text, hypertext markup language, to one another. So text is the basis of what we do, and typography is how text looks. So web design still is really grounded in typography, and a good understanding of it will get you further along your design process faster than starting with other things. It's also a content-first approach. And if you're not using a content-first approach, please see me afterwards, I'll sell you on that. But basically what that means is when we understand what the site is for, what need it is fulfilling, and what audience that is fulfilling it for, then we can just start designing the type for it right away. So once we understand the content, the basic content needs, we can start designing with type. Type itself is amenable to both systematic concerns and aesthetic ones. Obviously, we care about how it looks, that'd be the aesthetics, and CSS only provides us so many variables to play with, and those would be the systematic ones. Starting with type helps us establish the semantics of our markup, the accessibility of our markup, and the performance of our site immediately from the beginning. One of my beliefs is that front-end people like myself can be prep chefs for the final site, and ultimately, we're usually the ones tasked with dealing with all this stuff anyways, so make it easier for ourselves and start with semantics, accessibility, and performance. And last, type itself is the truly atomic level of design. Show of hands, has anybody heard of Brad Frost or heard the term atomic design? A couple people. The basic idea behind it is that you start making sites with little reusable components that become bigger reusable components that become templates that become your site. And for a CMS like Drupal, this is a really important concept because we can make instances of blocks now in Drupal 8 that are repeated on different templates. We can make regions, we can make layouts and nodes that get used in different ways. And so how do we make sure that we design these things so that they're coherent? We think of them as individual pieces first, and then how they fit together second. So type is truly the atomic level. If we can get a sentence right, we can get a paragraph right. If we can get a paragraph right, we can get an article right. If we can get an article right, we can get a node right. If we can get a node right, we can get the entire site right. So that's why we're starting with type, and it can even save lives. This is a link to a ProPublica article exploring how federal government agencies looked at their typography practices to save people's lives. Specifically, the National Oceanic Survey looked at sending out alerts with all caps. Well, when you make everything all caps, nothing's important. So they revised how they send out alerts for hurricanes and stuff like that. The Federal Highway Administration looked at their 65-year-old highway signs and said, we can do better and help save more people's lives. So I really encourage you to check this out. Type is important. It's the basis of what we do as visual communicators. So what is a type system? All right, so for those of you who were in Simon's presentation, this is one of those other ways I was talking about of looking at it. He talked about business requirements, he talked about user stories, he talked about where these things are and how they fit into his view of project management. I look at systems and say they're a closed set of relationships and then produce predictable results. In this case, we have inputs, what goes into a system, we have the objective, what we hope to get out of the system, and then we have the key results to measure whether or not we got there. So the equivalent to what Simon was talking about. The objective would be the business requirement. We want users to be able to sign up for DrupalCamp. The key results would be the form works and has labels that are accessible, right? It's something we can test for. A key result would be a user story, and the objective would be a business requirement for those of you who attended both. As far as the inputs go, I've got 4 of them listed here, and these are all things that I would like to understand as the designer or developer before trying to figure out what it is I should choose to show, right? I need to know the context of the project, what the budget is, what the timeline is, who's going to run it, who's going to write it, what our performance budget is. And if you don't know what a performance budget is, or you haven't been setting them lately, please see me afterwards. I will gladly talk your head off about those. I want to know the content of the proposed project. Specifically, I want to know the key task or key thing that a user is supposed to read or do on a site. So buying airline tickets, searching for library books, any of those things you would ask a user to do. I want to know the most important one because that's the thing I'll start with. Copy. I want to know 3 basic things. I want to know, is the purpose of the copy to be information? Is it to be inspiration? Or is it to be an interaction? So inspiration would be marketing copy, like get you to do something. Interactive would be the thing that you actually do. And information would be why you should do it, right? But I also want to know voice, whom is speaking to the user, and in what tense. And I'd want to know tone. Is it witty and irreverent like The Onion, or is it official like a government site? Those all filter into it, and obviously display is what we really, really care about, how it looks and under what conditions. Display also can factor in like existing brand standards or existing, display standards that you have to abide by. So those are all the things that we're going to consider as we go through it. And then on the other end, we'll have as what our actual type system is, what we would deliver to our team or system, our body copy size, our body copy scale, the font size, all our standard HTML tags, all defined, heading, display sizes, fonts, and variations, our baseline grid, and our multiple, and I'll explain that in a little bit, and then how to handle responsive concerns like how small do headers get on mobile devices, at what breakpoint, what's the map for that, and then how to scale up for extra large screens. So like I did not consider making my content work through this, so if any of these screens are jarring, just please raise your hand and I'll go to the next one because it'll be less jarring. I think there are a couple simple steps to actually making a type system. And like I said, I am assuming that this is the first thing that a developer or designer is doing on a project. But it doesn't have to be. It can work into your workflow in many ways. Think of it as a specific use case of the systems thinking that you were looking at with Simon's presentation. So here's the simple steps we're going to go through in more detail for the rest of the presentation. We're going to select body copy size. Then we're going to select our scale. We're going to select our body copy font. We're going to play with pairings for headings, display, and variations. We're going to establish vertical rhythm. And then we're going to consciously break all the rules. Now, a word on documentation. Do it early and do it often. Thank you, Chicago corrupt machine politics, for giving us that. I have it listed 6th on that previous slide. It should really be from the start and continuous. And when I say documentation, I'm talking about a central place that everybody on the team, including the client eventually if they want it, can view what decisions were captured and why. And the way that we do it at Spry, or the way we've been moving towards it, is for the front-end developer on the project to set up a style guide using our own pattern lab generator called Nimble Builder. My colleague Matthew Atkins made it. It's great. But you could use a simple Jekyll site. You could use Pattern Lab. You could make a static site. It doesn't matter. The point is, this works best when you document it and document it in the browser. So there is a style guide module for Drupal, but we found it to be really limiting and not all that useful. And like for other projects, we've often just taken a page, put in some dummy copy that has all of the HTML elements in it, and that way you can see kind of what it's supposed to look like in the browser. But because of cascading and inheritance that way, sometimes that doesn't work out so well either. My suggestion, use Pattern Lab. It's worth it. It's really good and helps you have a place to capture those things that come up during meetings and that you can refer to in testing. So body copy size. Can anybody guess why we're starting with size? No? Literally there are crickets outside. So no, that wasn't me. But size is a control variable. 16 pixels is 16 pixels is 16 pixels. I need something that I can make an apples to apples comparison with. And size is perfect for it because it's the root of all of it, and it's uniform across everything. So that's why we're starting with size, and we're starting with body copy size instead of like heading size, because we can set every element in our style sheet relative to a font size. And we'd want to do that with the paragraph size, right? So that's the concept of root M. Is everybody familiar with that? Show of hands. Does anybody not know what root M is? Okay. Real quickly, root M is the unit of measure from which you can use to make everything else relative to. And it's usually set for browsers or by your style or your reset style sheet to 16 pixels. In fact, I had a hard time finding an example that didn't have 16 pixels as the default. And 99% of the time I'll use it because I've gotten really good at multiplying and dividing by 16. But you can alter rem via CSS if you'd like. There's the code for it. The reason you would do that is because it would be easier to multiply by 10 pixels than 16, and that's really what you care about. The important thing here is that we're going to use absolute measurements as infrequently as possible and to establish relative measures elsewhere. And that's why we're going to make sure we at least are aware of what the root M on a site is and make sure that we're setting our body copy font size relative to it. If you just want to go with 1 rem equals 1 M, 16 pixels, there's nothing wrong with that because acceptable body copy sizes are anywhere between 12 pixels and 21 pixels. For most fonts, most of the time, a lot of text below 12 pixels is going to start to look illegible, and above 21 pixels is going to start to look like a header. And you don't want your body copy looking like a header because if everything is a header, then nothing is body. One other thing, if you have more headers in your documents than you would body copy, do not collect Go, do not collect $200, go directly to information architecture jail. You failed website design. Go back, start again. The only other time that we'll need to use absolute units like pixels is figuring out what our like grid gutters are if we do things right and plan well. So measure twice, cut once, that kind of idea. That's what we're going for with selecting a body copy size. And again, it doesn't have to be complicated. You can just go with 16 pixels. That's what most of the frameworks you're familiar with, like Foundation and Bootstrap, start with. And they start with it for a reason. Go read this next. This is about building resizable components. This guy gives like 25 reusable code samples for common components on sites. That's all done in M. And so if you're confused about how to do that without setting absolute pixel measurements, go read that next. It's on CSS Tricks and it's excellent and it was just published yesterday. So if you haven't read it yet, go read it. Next, we're going to choose scale. And scale is the visual relationship between the body copy size and other elements. So the most direct application of this is when we select our scale, we're going to get our heading sizes. And we're also going to get like our small text size and things like that. But we can also help take this scale idea to things like our baseline grid. We'll take it to our layout. We can take it to image aspect ratios even. And of course our grid system. So I like to use modularscale.com. There are a bunch of tools out there for it. One of the reasons I like modularscale.com is I can set multiple bases. So if I know what my grid column base will be, I can set that right here and I can figure out how wide my grid should be. So modularscale.com is the tool that I like to use. And again, we're going to pit this and we're going to control for it later on. So now we have two control variables. We've got body copy size and we've got scale. And those are going to help us design the rest of the system. Selecting a body copy font. The big keys are on the right here. Legibility is a minimum, readability is a requirement, desirability is an objective. And that basically means it must be legible. You should want it to be readable. Legibility and readability are not the same thing. Many things are legible that are not readable, and if you've ever been to a Jimmy John's, they usually have a poster that gives you incomplete or jumbled words, and you can still read it because it's legible, but it's not readable. Desirability is an objective, and that means it should be appropriate to the project. And that takes into account all those things that I was talking about in terms of inputs into the system. And factors in choosing, we're going to look at different fonts' X height, width, space, and kern, the contrast inside of the font, the weight of the font, existing brand standards, budget, can they afford the license, and the performance implications of the body copy font. Again, we're starting with body copy because we're after big wins. If we get body copy right, we're most of the way there to getting the type system done. So X height is the concept of the baseline of the letter to the top of the lowercase of the letter. And generally speaking, taller X heights are more legible at further distances. And that doesn't necessarily mean you always go with the taller X height. Not to make this complicated, but by definition, when you raise the X height, you lower the distinctiveness of individual letter forms. And distinctive letter forms can help with legibility and readability as well. So here's a good example. We've got Garamond on the left, and it has an okay X height. But it has really distinctive letter forms, like the bottom of the G and the serifs on it. And then on the right, we have Droid Serif, which was designed for user interface use. And it has a taller X height and is very legible, but is not nearly as distinct as Garamond. So be aware of that. There's a trade-off there. There's a trade-off in pretty much every decision you'll make with type, so there's no hard and fast rule. As far as letter width, letter spacing, and kern, they're three separate concepts but related. Specifically, width refers to how wide the letters are. In the example below, you've got narrow versus regular. And then you've got how the letters are spaced. Most will have a natural spacing, unless they are specifically monospaced. If you open up your text editor and you've got Courier or Computer Modern or something like that, that's a monospaced font, as opposed to most fonts that you'll see out in the real world are naturally spaced. And you'll want to know what effect you're after and why to choose one or the other. And then kern is the designer term for the spacing between the letters. The CSS variable equivalent is letter spacing. So when I say letter spacing, sometimes the designer hears something different than what I meant, which is the CSS property. And that's for everybody to know and understand. Contrast and weight are two related concepts. Weight is how heavy it is, specifically how bold it is. And so on the left, we've got Arial regular, and on the right, we've got Arial black. So black would be the super bold version of regular old Arial. And then contrast is like the difference in how thin a letter can get and to how wide it can get. And over on the left, we've got Georgia, which has a pretty consistent and regular contrast. And then on the right, we've got Crimson, which has a lot more contrast in its letter forms. So it can go from really, really wide in certain letters to really, really narrow, as opposed to Georgia, which is more uniform. And that would make sense because Georgia was designed to be read on the screen. CSS font weight accepts 100 to 900 values in the keywords normal and bold. Normal is set to a font weight of 400, and bold is set to a font weight of 700. So try to avoid using faux bold, and that would be using the 700 variety of a font weight. If you have the room in your budget, your performance budget, to do so, load the bold or semi-bold variant of it and make sure that its font weight is set to normal. So that will load the normal version of the bold variation. Ideally, you don't want to use the 100 to 200, those numbers if you can avoid it, because you're going to get some faux stuff. Try to find the variation you're looking for if you can. Might not always be able to, given whatever your performance budget is on a given project, but try to avoid faux bold and faux italic, and that's another topic for a different time. Now, once we have our body copy font, it's time to play with pairings. And this is the fun part for me because a lot of different things can look great together. We want to kind of have an idea of why a pairing will work or won't work. Basically, I'm talking about understanding the difference between a serif and a sans serif, or humanist versus geometric versus slab. And you can learn a lot about the individual fonts themselves and the font designers and get a little bit of sense of design history If you check out places like Typekit or or fonts.com, they have a lot of information about that. That'll help inform you, but like the basic thing is, does it look good together? And to judge that, we're going to keep that scale that we chose constant from what we picked out earlier. We're going to keep the body copy constant from what we just decided. And we're going to work top down, H1 to H6. And I like to define all of them, even if a design doesn't necessarily call for it, because more often than not, we end up using H5s and H6s in weird places, like footers. How many times have you had like an about us or a contact us? That semantically ought to be a header, but it, doesn't necessarily fit into the rest of the hierarchy that you've already established for everything else. Doesn't need to be monolithic. We can play with variations. We can use different fonts if we so choose. We should really look at using bolder or uppercase text. Play with weights and variations. You ought to be able to tell at a glance what an H1 is versus an H6, and size is actually the worst way to do that. You want to make sure that there's enough variety within your heading system that somebody could just tell at a glance what the hierarchy of that page is. So let's take a look at some of the stuff. This is an example from ClearLeft. This is their style guide, and it shows, what is an H1 and what is it used for. It shows what a header example is, what a third level header is, and what a fourth level header is, i.e. your H1s, H2s, H3s, H4s, and it describes their usage too, which I think is really important. We're also going to define their size, line height, margin, and multiple. And so I'll come back to what the multiple is, but you should get a sense now that we're defining everything as we go. Okay? And then, how do we know a pairing is good? This question came up when I presented this before. There's no good answer. Really, your designer's intuition comes into it, and the only way to get that is it's a lot of experience in finding out what works and what doesn't work. So my suggestion is to go watch this video on Ira Glass on the creative process. Basically, he says you start with good taste, and then you figure out why it is that you have good taste later as you keep doing this stuff. And you just got to keep working through it. And that's my advice too, because Ira Glass is a lot more famous and better at his job than I am at mine. So build a lot of sites, take a lot of risks, make your own mistakes, fumble your way to knowledge. And then another good way to do this is to look at and critically evaluate what others make. Don't mistake critique for judging, however. Please don't crap on other designers' work. You don't know what constraints they labored under. A good place to start with that is typewolf.com. This wonderful guy picks a new site every day, tells you what fonts are on it, and you get to decide for yourself if you like it or not. Then you get to figure out why you like it or not. So that would be how I would suggest to understand how to get good at this stuff. As far as what looks good together, let's take a look at a couple examples. So we could have complementary pairings. So on the left, we've got source sans and noto serif. Source sans works great for everything, pretty much, but it works really great here. And having a sans and then a serif combination is pretty common and very classic design tool. We could also do contrasting, and contrasting is not like, oh, they look so different. It's actually, they are very similar, but they're just different enough to do different jobs better. So on the right, we've got Conqueror for that big headline and web design and writing, and then the actual text itself is in Proxima Nova, which works great for body copy pretty much no matter where you go. And then we can also use from the same family. A lot of times designers will make different versions of fonts, like a sans version, a serif version, a slab version, etc. They were designed to go with each other, and when it works to use the same family or super family, you should. Over here we've got an example where they're using the freight sans for the headlines and freight text for the text, although they probably could do a little bit better job of blurring that background image so you could actually read the bottom. And don't be afraid to actually use the same font throughout your heading system and your body copy. Just because you can choose different fonts doesn't necessarily always mean that you need to. On the right is actually St. Louis Public Radio's site, and they use Lato throughout because it's readable. They can incorporate enough variety using weights and variations to achieve the objective that they need, which is this is a headline, this is body copy, this is how you find out more about it. Right? So those are some examples in the wild. And then the important thing is there are no rules. They're more what you call guidelines. Okay? Like, there's no hard and fast rule of typography. Ultimately, it's about what looks great and fits for your project. So don't think I'm making a certain recommendation just to make it or be authoritative about it. You will know better than me for your project. So, other typesetting rules of thumb, ideal line length, so how long the line should be. It's between 45 and 75 characters. You can go up to 100 on the web without too big of a jump for most people's eyes. Just remember, the longer the line length, the higher the line height you need. And that could be too big of a jump. Just don't go full width. There's nothing that says lazy designer like going full width of your grid for content. Use center aligned, right aligned, and justified text sparingly. They're just harder to read, to be perfectly honest with you. So less is better. Also, if everything is normally left aligned and you pick like one or two things to put center, that'll help draw attention to things that are actually important, as opposed to putting everything center aligned. Define anchor styles as soon as possible. I was talking about this before the presentation, but the basic thing about a website is it links you to other information on other pages, right? The anchor is the key killer app about the web. So define your anchor styles, be consistent, and make sure they pass accessibility standards. So far, I've only mentioned testing type in grayscale, but if you do have color in your design, you need to test for that. Two things to be concerned about here. The first is that color will change how text looks, and so you need to account for that. And the second is, if you were in Kevin's presentation, he did an excellent job of explaining why WCAG standards are important and how to test for them. It takes like 5 minutes, and your designers will thank you when you explain that you're going to make their site more beautiful for more people that way. So be sure to check that against WCAG standards for accessibility, and show variations of what not to do if need be. So if you're going to hand it off to an internal team, if you're at an agency or a government contractor, make sure you give code samples and what not to do, as well as ideal for it, so that you're not leaving them without instruction and training. Vertical rhythm is this idea. We're making a shift, folks. So now we're talking about typesetting proper, and we have our headings, we have our body copy, we have like our list items, we have our anchor tags. We've got those all kind of defined in basic ways. Now we're going to put them on a vertical grid, and the reason we're going to do this is because vertical rhythm helps with ease of reading, and it maintains harmony between blocks of text. So it's useful for helping things display as a unit separate from this unit, right? And you can view this visually with typecast or a few lines of CSS. You click that link, it'll take you to the source code for basehold.it, which you can also just insert into your SAS style sheet and test the stuff as you go along. I found it to be really helpful, and that's what a baseline grid basically looks like. If you notice, just about every line of text is on one of those lines, and that's not by accident. I'm going to show you a very simple way of how to do that. There are a lot more sophisticated ways, and if you like those other ways, go do it. You're right. Okay? So here's how we're going to get rhythm. I'm going to take the size of the element. So we'll start with the body copy one. We're going to multiply it by our line height, which we're going to have as a unitless measure so that we can make sure that we're consistent across elements. We're going to add margin bottom to it. You can add margin top if you like, but I find most designs call for my headers to be flush to the very top of the container, and so I don't like to have to write a separate rule where I have to make them flush to it. That's going to give us our multiple, and that multiple is going to form the basis for our baseline grid. So in this example, which is a pretty common one, we've got a body copy size of 16 pixels multiplied by 1.5, which gives us a product of 24 pixels. We're going to add a margin bottom of 24 pixels, and that gives us a nice round number of 48 pixels. Something that large, we can have it in half and still get a reasonable baseline of 24 pixels. Everybody tracking with me, you can nod your heads. Some nodding, some not. Okay, good. Now every element can be laid out on a vertically rhythmic grid, 24 pixels tall. And this is great when you got long copy, long form articles of every size and shape, because we're asking people to read a lot of text on a screen that's going to hurt their eyes if they have to do too much work. The more important point for you designers in the room is now that we have the rules, we can break this rhythm intentionally. And what do I mean by that? I mean things like this. This is actually a collage of several different sites, but they all play with our perceptions of what is good and right about design, or good and right on the web, and they do it in really interesting ways, and they consciously vary from what they've established as their systems on the site. We can vary the amount of fonts we use, we can vary the size and color and the layout, we can vary how we're calling attention to things and scale. We can vary even the orientation of things. We can use drop caps. All of these things can help us draw the attention to things that are actually important on our page, as opposed to just letting the user try to figure it out. Usually it doesn't work that way. Let's help our users figure out what's important. Bulletproofing. These next two slides are near and dear to my heart, and I said I would talk about performance in mind, so here's where we're starting to talk about it. For designers in the room, stick to one font provider. Doesn't matter who you do, but like stick to one per project. It's a pain loading from multiple ones, and I'll talk about font loading in a second. Define your fallbacks. So not every site will behave the way you want, and the web is a hostile environment. You can't choose for your user what connection they use, what device they use, etc. So you have to be somewhat flexible in your font selection. And at the very least, you should go ahead and leave serif, sans serif, or monospace at the very end, because that way some of your text will be readable, like all of your text will be readable and usable under any connection. And it might not look the way you want it to, but you'll have a fallback as opposed to relying on the web to do things for you that it shouldn't. Identify snowflakes. So the inciting event for this speech was I was developing a design that a designer had handed me, and every text element was slightly different than the rest. And I was like, this is madness. And he goes, no, this is Spry. Sorry, 300 reference. So I'm not anti-Snowflake. I am pro-exhausting a system first. And the reason is because when we have a system, we can know why we're breaking a rule, and we can defend that to a client, a stakeholder, etc. And if you're looking for a good place to find snowflakes, check your homepage design. That's usually where you're going to have exceptions to any kind of other rules that you've got elsewhere on your site. And that's why I don't start designing with my homepage. Plan for performance. Try to keep total font variations that you're using in FontFace to 5 or less, or 100 kilobytes or less. That recommendation comes from the Filament Group. They won Agency of the Year last year, and they've done amazing work on improving the performance of sites. They did the first responsive redesign of the Boston Globe, which was the first major news outlet to go responsive. They know what they're doing, and this is their recommendation. The other recommendation they make is to choose a font loading strategy. So is anybody interested in talking next year at this thing? I have a free talk idea for you. Font loading strategies. Tell me about font loading strategies, and I will attend and live tweet you and put you on blast because it's important and we need to talk about it. There's no good option here. They all have JavaScript dependencies. So if your user has JavaScript turned off for whatever reason, like you might be SOL anyway, and they all have some really bad trade-offs. The best overall is flash of unstyled text. That's what Faut is with a class. And basically that is you set all of your body copy to a fallback font, and then you use asynchronous JavaScript loading to load it in later. And then that, when it is downloaded, adds it in as a class to the entire body and paints for the rest of it. That way you immediately get readable text, and you do get a flash of unstyled text before it's finished downloading, but on promise it loads it. And you can check out fontfaceobserver.com or .io for that. But that's like the industry standard right now. And it's going to change because if you got to deal with service workers, so offline content, or you are moving to HTTP2, which we will soon at some point, we have no idea exactly how that's going to work. So if anybody wants a free talk idea for next year, please tell me about font loading strategies. On the right, there are a couple options there. Unceremonious, font face, preload, font swap. Like I said, those are all options, but they're not necessarily good options. And no one is going to be right for every project. You just need to figure out what's right for your project, and that starts when you start talking performance budgets up front. And even just considering what a font loading strategy you're going to choose will help you figure out what's important. And then last, it's better to abstain than it is to use web fonts incorrectly. And this is just saying, don't make a 3 megabyte page and have a lot of it be these really heavy, unoptimized images and fonts. Like, you're better than that. Don't do that. So, font loading strategies are part of performance, and they're part and parcel in building great sites now. So consider them, learn them, try new things out, and try to see what works best for your site. System in all things is the soul of business. I'm going to attribute it to George Washington. It was actually just one of his favorite phrases. But if it worked for the founder of our country, it will work for you and your agency and your project. System in all things is the soul of business. It'll help you be more elegant in your solutions because everything will fit together. You can fit systems together to achieve parsimony. You'll get simplicity in being able to train your people on it and being able to scale it or maintain it because it'll be easier to debug. It's a great gateway drug for getting designers into code, which I find extremely useful because they don't think like us, i.e. they don't think rationally. And and it's a great way for developers to learn some design skills too. It'll introduce economy, and so your business people will love it, and it's there for the taking in terms of making your sites better, more usable for everyone. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out, and I really appreciate the Drupal community for letting me speak. Thanks.